Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on skilled volunteer engagement put on by the New Hampshire Center for Nonprofits in partnership with VQ Volunteer Strategies. We're excited to be bringing this workshop today. As all of you know, mostly because you've signed up for this webinar, but as you know, volunteerism is changing every day, and new volunteer trends are offering nonprofits and all organizations an unprecedented opportunity to harness the skills and talents of these new generations of volunteers who are coming to our nonprofit organizations. A recent study that was done by Common Impact about using high-skilled volunteers in our sector had some pretty dramatic results. When asked about what extent using a high-impact volunteer had enabled an organization to meet their mission, 48% of the folks who used high-skilled volunteers said that they had a significant impact on the organization's ability to meet their mission. And another 42% said that they had some impact on that ability. So that total of almost 90% of organizations who used high-skilled volunteers, it's recognized that it's a great way to increase our ability to serve our communities and meet our mission. My name again is Lorette Edelman. I'm the Assistant Director here at the Center for Nonprofits, and we are excited to be bringing not only this webinar, but also this the High Impact Volunteer Engagement Program in partnership with Volunteer New Hampshire with funding from the Corporation for National and Community Service and their Volunteer Generation Fund. A few housekeeping items before we start. Today's webinar will be recorded and we'll be posting it on our website within a few days. We also have you all muted right now, but we would like to hear from you. We'll be doing a couple of polls during the presentation, and we'll be answering questions at key points throughout the presentation. If you have a question, please ask your question by using the chat box on your screen. At the end of the session, when we start talking about the cohort program and applications for that, we will unmute people so that we can have some live questions and answers. I'm very pleased to introduce today's speaker, Beth Steinhorn of VQ Volunteer Strategies. Partners with organizations and their leadership to increase their impact through strategic and innovative engagement. Beth is the author of multiple books and articles on strategic volunteer engagement, and she's a wicked smart woman, a very popular speaker and trainer throughout the country, and she's known for her interactive and inspiring presentations. We're really excited to be working with Beth again this year and bringing this program back to you, and we're looking forward to learning as much from Beth as all of you are as well. So take it away, Beth.
Thank you, Lorette, and thank you all for joining us today. Good afternoon. I'm so thrilled to be partnering with the New Hampshire Center for Nonprofits again and to be bringing in Volunteer New Hampshire for this project. As Lorette mentioned, though I have to say I've never been introduced with the term wicked before, that makes my day. But in any case, I'm president of VQ Volunteer Strategies. Our company just changed names as of 2 weeks ago. We were formerly known as JF Fixler Group, so it's possible you've heard of us before, especially given our previous work with many organizations in New Hampshire. So I just wanted to take a moment to share with you a little bit about VQ Volunteer Strategies. Our name change reflects our belief in the concept of VQ, Volunteer Quotient, which is an organization's ability to leverage volunteer talent for bigger, smarter impact. We are so excited to be able to share with you all today some ideas, trends, strategies to help you engage skilled volunteers at your organization in order to increase your impact. And as Lorette mentioned, towards the end of the call, we'll also be sharing ways that you can apply to be part of our new initiative, which is revitalizing of what was known as the HIVE initiative, High Impact Volunteer Engagement. I'm calling in, just so you know, from my office in Colorado, but I'm very much looking forward to being able to return to New Hampshire a number of times over the next couple of years to be able to work with 15 different organizations across the state on this initiative. But before we share those opportunities, let me give you a little overview of what we hope to achieve in the next 90 minutes or 80 minutes or so. We're going to start, as Laurette did, by talking a little bit about volunteer engagement trends and issues. I will be sharing some of the things we've seen, certainly through research as well as through our work across the country, but we definitely want to hear from you and your experiences at your organizations in terms of volunteer demographics and interests and changing motivations for how individuals can and are engaging with your agencies. We'll also then share a model for high impact volunteer engagement. What do the foundations of a high impact volunteer engagement strategy look like? In other words, what does it look like when we shift from viewing volunteers as one program of many at our organization to instead considering volunteer engagement as a resource and a strategy that can help all parts of our agencies achieve mission? We'll then also share a model for change so that you can begin to take steps in shifting the way that your organization approaches volunteer engagement from this programmatic approach to instead a more strategic and holistic approach. And then finally, we'll leave 20 to 30 minutes at the end to be able to introduce this initiative that's being launched very soon in New Hampshire and that you are invited to apply for if it's a good fit for your organization. And as Laurette said, we'll also unmute folks at that point and be sure to give ample opportunity for conversation and questions. So that's our agenda, our itinerary for our call today. And we're going to start with trends. I always like to share my perspective that when we learn about trends in volunteer engagement, or frankly in any area of our organization's work, we always have a choice. We can continue doing what we're doing because, you know, we've always done it that way. And when we do that, we tend to work despite trends. We tend to do what we're doing in spite of whatever is happening out in the landscape of volunteerism or our economic landscape or our community's social landscape. But if we really want to be strategic, we have the opportunity to not work despite the trends, but instead to leverage these trends on behalf of our organization. So as I lay out that perspective, I'd love to open it up to a little bit of virtual conversation using the chat box and ask you all to share just in a phrase or two some of the challenges or observations you're seeing in terms of volunteer engagement at your organizations. Are more people coming to your organization to volunteer? Are you challenged by engaging a certain age group of volunteers? Are volunteers demanding something different from your organization than they have over the previous couple decades? I'd invite you to use your chat box and share either with everyone or just with the organizers a couple thoughts. And as folks are typing, this is me tap dancing, waiting for you all to share a couple thoughts, I will just briefly share a couple of the topics and things that we tend to observe as I travel around the country working with teams and individuals from organizations like yours. So hopefully a few folks are following up with some ideas. I do see some questions as well. Oh, they're coming in the question box. Okay. So let me see some of the, well, I'll share my list, and then I'll hopefully give you all a chance to add a couple other comments, and then I'll go back and look at the chat and the questions that have come in. So the types of topics we hear when I ask these questions when I'm in a room where I can see you all, one of the first things that comes up is the way that volunteers are willing to share their time. Is it more? Is it less? Is it different? Not often at the top of the list, but certainly not far behind the first few things that are mentioned are some issues around technology. So we'll talk about that today. Fortunately, unlike when I first did this initiative with the Center for Nonprofit, New Hampshire Center for Nonprofits, when we were really the tail end of a prolonged recession, economics were a big factor, but they remain a very big factor. So we're going to talk about that today. One of the top things that comes up is, of course, generational shifts. And then another topic that may not be named directly, but is definitely affecting many organizations with whom we speak and train and consult, are issues around changing philanthropy. So those are some of the topics we're going to talk about today. And right now, I'm going to look at some of the comments that folks have shared. Although maybe it's a little hard to read this. Let's see. Volunteers are willing to give their time, but not support the organization financially, which is really interesting. People really interested in giving time. Sometimes that's viewed as a generational thing, that younger volunteers really want to give their time, but aren't necessarily ready to give of their dollars. Though there are some really compelling links between between giving of time and giving of money, but that tends to be tied more to older volunteers. So thank you for sharing that. They want their time invested to be, they want the time that they're giving to be truly meaningful and impactful. Absolutely. That is a huge one that I think is extremely important in thinking about how we create volunteer roles. And are the roles that volunteers have been offered through our organization meaningful enough for our volunteers and, frankly, for our staff as well? Because volunteers more than ever want to be making a tangible difference. Essentially, people will volunteer if asked. You know, the personal ask still reigns supreme, but we need to not get too caught up in technology and avoid or overlook the importance of making a personal ask of our potential volunteers. So thank you. There's lots of other things. Let's see. My HR department and fiscal department oftentimes respond to any community service projects with what about liability? So thank you for bringing up that question, Beth. Not me, but someone else named Beth who brought that question up. You know, to me that raises the question of staff buy-in and support for volunteer engagement, and how can we ensure that our colleagues, including our HR departments, understand what and that we can all get on the same page around the risks and the benefits of engaging volunteers. So thank you. If we have time, I'll look through some of these others as well, but that's just a smattering of what a number of people have mentioned, and thank you for that. So I'm going to keep moving forward, and some of these will also resonate with a few of the things I haven't read aloud yet. So let's go into these trends in a little bit more depth. Let's start with time. A couple people mentioned in their comments the issue of time. People are willing to give their time if they're asked. Other people are saying they're not willing to give as much time as in the past. And we definitely see in the volunteer research that volunteers today are not as willing and available and comfortable committing to long-term, ongoing volunteer commitments. So the days of most of our volunteers signing up for a Tuesday afternoon from 1 to 5 p.m. shift are waning. Those days are nearly gone, but that doesn't mean that people aren't volunteering. But they're volunteering if they're able to make shorter-term commitments and see the chance to have a beginning, a middle, and yes, even an end to their engagement with your organization. And that having a lower bar, a lower threshold to jump over in order to engage with you makes it easier for us to cultivate new volunteers. So it puts an interesting challenge on us as leaders of volunteers around how we're structuring our volunteer roles. And do we really need to continue to require an entire hour, an entire year commitment, or a regular schedule, or can people have control over their time and self-schedule? The additional burden, or maybe opportunity, if we want to look at it from a glass half full approach, to this challenge around time is that volunteers, as someone mentioned, are so motivated today by making a tangible difference that if they're going to share their time with us, we need to articulate exactly how that time is going to be useful. What are the tangible benefits of that they're going to reap for themselves and for our mission that's going to make their time worth it? A second trend is this issue of technology. And technology really provides us with an amazing opportunity to leverage volunteers who aren't even living in our communities, to leverage volunteers who do live in our communities but have really busy schedules and can't come during their work hours of Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, or can't come on evenings or weekends because they're caring for children or older parents. So how can we leverage technology, first of all, to create work and access to work for our organization where volunteers can do some of this work on their own schedule, even from their homes or their offices? And secondly, how can we leverage technology to help transform every staff member, every donor, every current volunteer into talent scouts on behalf of our organizations? Imagine the potential if every person who was connected to your organization currently, program participants, donors, board members, other current volunteers, staff members, even past staff members, those who come to your events, if all those people shared a message about your organization and its mission and the opportunity to share your skills and talents to help you expand that mission and achieve that mission with every friend or connection that they have on Facebook or LinkedIn or in their contacts page, imagine the reach that you could have if you could deputize these people as talent scouts or as ambassadors on behalf of your organization. That's what technology can do for us if we're really intentional about it. The third trend is, as I like to call it, changing economics. Fortunately, we don't have old George Washington here with his hands on his forehead saying, oh my goodness, because of a recession. But what happened during the recession from 2009 for the next couple years really forever sealed in some vital trends in volunteer engagement. Up until that point, volunteering was something that people occasionally put on their resumes, but really only as an afterthought. But during that time period when we had record low employment rates, record high unemployment, or underemployment, when people were perhaps working but not in the area that really they had chosen as their career, very high percentages of our nation's adults were volunteering in order to keep their resumes fresh, to gain new skills, in order to be more marketable on the job market. That trend has not gone away. In fact, in a somewhat recent study a couple of years ago by LinkedIn, a survey of hiring professionals, basically headhunters, at that time, just a couple years ago, already 44% of hiring professionals said that they consider volunteer experience on par with paid work experience when they're making hiring decisions. So the more that we can continue, and that was post-recession, the more we can continue to help our volunteers and our potential volunteers make the connection between their volunteer work and their current or future employability, especially for Gen Xers and Millennials, the more appealing we can make volunteering at our organization. The flip side of this, excuse me, of this changing economics issue is that, of course, now that we have in many parts of the country record low unemployment, it is a little more challenging for some people to find volunteers. So that's a challenge. One of the comments that one of you all contributed, Carol, I think it was, said companies aren't as willing to allow groups to come in during company time to volunteer. It's leaving you shorthanded, especially during the holiday time. That's interesting, Carol, because many people are saying that part of these changing economics and changing philanthropy, as I had noted before, is that companies are less willing to give cash donations and instead are wanting their employees, they're wanting to meet their employees' needs and desires to volunteer. And so we're seeing many organizations with the burden or opportunity of trying to find ways for groups to volunteer at their agencies. Though you, Carol, are saying that that's shifting as well. And you're being left shorthanded because companies are switching their policies. So we see lots of different trends, sometimes conflicting, and the more we're aware of them and the more we understand them, the more we can develop strategies that are going to help us address them. So let's look a little bit at some basic data around volunteering in the country. I'm not going to be going into great detail in this, but I always like to do a little bit of a public service announcement about this great resource if you're not familiar with it. Volunteeringinamerica.gov is a website of the Corporation for National and Community Service, which is our federal agency dedicated to volunteering and service in this country. For a long time, every year at the end of the calendar year, they put out a report on the previous year's volunteering data. It's possible due to budget issues this will only go to an every other year cycle, but the latest data we have is for 2015 because that report was put out in December of 2016, and hopefully in the next 2 months we'll get 2016 data. So for 2015 we know that the average or the volunteering rate across the country among adults is nearly 25%. How does that compare to previous, how does that compare to New Hampshire, or how does New Hampshire stack up against that? You can go into this database and slice and dice the data in innumerable ways, looking at not just national rates, but also your state's rates. So you'll see here that New Hampshire, I'm sure it won't be a surprise to any of you, significantly out-volunteers the rest of the country with 28.6% of residents volunteering. And so graphically, you can see the trends, the U.S. trends, with a slight decline. The 2004-2005 spike was still part of a significant spike post 9/11. But even despite that, the trend is going down slightly. This is the first time in a long time that we've dropped below 25%. Yet New Hampshire, woohoo, New Hampshire is on the rise. So a great increase in New Hampshire volunteering. Again, I'm sure that isn't a surprise to you, given that your residents have a strong, strong history of rolling up your sleeves and helping neighbors and investing their time and skills in their community. What that means for you is that you don't have the burden of making the case to potential volunteers to volunteer. You just need to make the case for them to volunteer at your organization. There are other states who fall well below that blue line of the average for the U.S., and they have an extra challenge. One of the great resources, one of the great things that I think is about one of the most valuable pieces of this data resource is the information about generational volunteering. So I'd like to ask you all, before I get into some of the data around generational volunteering, Stephen, we're going to open the first poll question, which will give all of you as participants the chance to answer a question and share your experiences. Stephen, is it? I have this on my slide, but I'm not sure if there's something I need to do for folks to be able to see the poll. Do they open it on their screen? There they go. Okay, so Len, I just figured it out. On your screen, on your dashboard, click on the polls little arrow, so the arrow points down, and you should have a question right there, which I'll read aloud. Which of the following best describe the age distribution of your current volunteer corps? And I see some of you are answering, so thank you. You have a couple choices there. We have mostly older volunteers. B, we have mostly boomers or Gen X. C, we have mostly millennials or teens. D, pretty even distribution, or E, don't know. So let's give you just another moment or two. I see not everyone, only about 2/3 of you have voted, so oh good, a couple others are joining in. Don't be left behind, get in that election day spirit. Cast your vote. It's a good week to have this webinar. Great, so I think we're going to close the polls now. Thank you. So thanks to most of you for voting here or sharing your feedback. We have almost 40% of you, 39% have mostly older volunteers, greatest generation, silent generation, maybe some older boomers. Not shocking, lots of organizations are experiencing that. 22% of you have mostly boomers and Gen Xers. And then another 1/5 of you, about 22%, are pretty evenly distributed. So that's a pretty typical, none of that is surprising to me. The 40% of you that have mostly older volunteers, of course, the corollary to this question is, and how is this distribution working for you? Are you facing, is this a sustainable model for you? It may be, but with the inevitable aging out of volunteers, do you have a pipeline of younger volunteers who are going to fill those spaces? Those who have an even distribution, I think that's great. The fact that a 1/5 of you, a little more, have some even distribution puts you in a position to sustain and be a little more nimble and flexible as we're moving forward. And of course, the 10 or 11% of you who don't know, it's a great thing to learn so you can begin to develop strategies that can ensure that your work is sustainable with an ongoing resource of volunteer talent. So let's delve a little deeper into some of these generations. We're not going to spend too much time on it, but I do want to at least talk a little bit about the hallmarks of these different generations, because for the first time in American history, we have 4, maybe even 5 generations, if we count teens, working and volunteering side by side. And that places an interesting both challenge and opportunity for us. We start with a generation I'm lumping together called Traditionalists. These are greatest and silent generation volunteers, those born before or during World War II. These volunteers have been the backbone of so many of our organizations for the last century. It was Traditionalists, greatest generation and silent generation individuals who were the founders of many of our organizations. They really built the nonprofit sector in the 20th century in the United States and created the volunteer model that we have. This legacy of their creation was built by and for them. Built by and for a generation that was driven by loyalty, practicality, and patience, paying dues over time and eventually rising up to the pinnacle of volunteer engagement, being tapped on the shoulder and asked to join a committee or a board. That was the pinnacle of achievement in terms of volunteer engagement. And I hope some of you are smiling or rolling your eyes and recognizing that today, for especially Gen Xers and Millennials, that motivation isn't there in the same way. And neither is the opportunity to view retirement as a chance to stop working and volunteer full-time, which is what many Greatest and Silent Generation volunteers have done. And because our systems were built to serve them, for the last 10 years, our volunteer systems have been challenged by, first, this next generation, the baby boomers, and then the generations that followed. Baby boomers, born between 1946 and 1964, were at the time the largest generation. There's been a lot of writing around boomers, and I'm sure this isn't the first time any of you on this call have been considering how to tap into this skilled generation. Baby boomers had the potential that they were offering the nonprofit sector reached almost mythic proportions in the mid-2000s as the first boomers were approaching their 60th and 65th birthdays, approaching retirement age, because nonprofits were anticipating with bated breath the 75 or 80 million boomers knocking on their doors saying, great, we're done working and we're ready to retire. But we know that that didn't happen, partly because of the recession, and partly because boomers never intended to retire in the way that their parents did. Research showed through volunteer matches, Great Expectations research, and lots of other research that's out there and available through encore.org, baby boomers, long before that recession in 2008 and 2009 hit, anticipated volunteering and still working in some way through retirement. And yet, they required more flexibility than any previous generation. While success in volunteer engagement for Greatest and Silent Generation volunteers was measured by retention, how many years volunteers stayed in the same position, at the same organization, waiting to earn their 20-year PIN, baby boomers were the first generation not to stay in their same houses, in their same jobs, even their same marriages, and yet our system for volunteering was built expecting them to stay in the same volunteer role for years on end. And they challenged that. They were the first generation, even before millennials, to say, if you don't have what I want at your organization, I'm going to take my time and skills and go elsewhere. Then there's Gen X. Very little discussed generation because we are, and I say we because I'm a Gen Xer, an old Gen Xer, but a Gen Xer nonetheless. We are a small generation population-wise. Our parents were the ones born right before and during World War II, so there were very few of them, which means there's consequently very few of us, Gen Xers. And Gen Xers were long written off as an apathetic and disengaged generation. And yet, it may surprise some of you to know that since 2012, Gen X has led the nation in volunteer rates, higher than any other age group, not just at their age, but currently in terms of volunteering. So if you're not tapping into Gen X volunteers, then you're missing the boat. However, Gen Xers demand even more flexibility than baby boomers, because Gen Xers are still balancing, often if they have families, they're balancing kids still living at home, aging parents, and a career, usually either with single parents or with two adults working in the home. So flexibility is really, really key to tapping into Gen Xers' volunteer spirit. And yet Gen Xers also are the leading generation for entrepreneurship. So if you are looking for some innovation in your organization, some social enterprise endeavors, some new pilots, which we're going to be talking about later, Gen Xers are a great generation to tap. And finally, we get to millennials. Those born between 1981 and 2000, the children of baby boomers, like their parents, millennials are known for challenging the status quo, for having a tremendous global sense of global responsibility and a desire to make a difference. Millennials are digital natives. They're the most globally connected generation, and yet they are in some ways the least likely to affiliate with an organization, because millennials are motivated by the chance to make a difference for a cause, less so by the chance to affiliate with an institution. So how can we frame our opportunities to tap into their cause-minded hearts and hands? And that's one of the secrets to engaging millennials. I often like to put this distinction between boomers, Xers, and millennials as follows. Baby boomers were the first generation to approach an organization with the interest potentially in volunteering and say, oh, if you don't have what I'm looking for in your volunteer opportunities, I'm going to take my time and skills and go to another organization. Xers are the first generation to approach an organization and say, oh, you don't have the opportunity that I'm looking for to volunteer. You don't provide me with a chance to balance my work life and my personal life. I'm going to go create my own organization to address that issue because I'm entrepreneurial. I know how to create organizations. And millennials are going to look at you and say, who needs an organization? I can just reach out to all my friends using my social networks, say, here's a problem, let's go do a food drive, let's go clean up this park, let's go raise some funds for this cause, and we're going to make a difference ourselves. So what we have first with Xers and then subsequently with millennials are free agent volunteers. How can we not work despite that trend, but instead tap into that trend? And that's one of the challenges and opportunities with these multiple generations all volunteering at the same time. So here's a summary of some of the characteristics that I've just given you a crash course in, though I'm sure you're familiar with many of them. And the good news is this: while each generation is different and unique in many ways, the biggest difference is, of course, between traditionalists on the far left and everybody else. So if we get it right with boomers or Xers and millennials, we're better positioned to get it right with the others. Because some of the characteristics that these generations all share is that they have a keen desire for flexibility in their volunteer work. They view you as colleagues rather than coming in and wanting to be told what to do, how to do it, when to do it, and where to do it. They're interested in having a say in the work, in helping to shape the mission and the work of your organization, to truly be partners. They want to use their skills or gain new skills, and ultimately, as I've said before, they want to make an impact. So what does it look like when an organization leverages these trends rather than works despite the trends? It looks a little bit like this. It looks like the shift from traditional volunteer management, where there you are, or your volunteer coordinator or volunteer director, standing up there on that arrow, telling these dutiful volunteers what to do, where to go, and how to get there, to instead a world of volunteer engagement, where volunteers and staff and leadership together are setting the vision for the organization and working as partners to reach that vision. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, in the next 2 slides, some of the ways that what it means in terms of volunteer management to shift from volunteer management to volunteer engagement in terms of some of these traditional best practices in volunteer management. You know, the 3 R's. Recruitment, retention, and recognition. And as I do that, feel free, because after that I'm also going to pause for some questions. So if anyone does have aha moments or questions that you'd like to share in the chat box, please do so, because I'm happy to pause. And then following that, I'll also share some case studies and some tools to help you begin to make this shift as well, from management to engagement, or at least to move further down the spectrum wherever your organization currently is. So what does it look like? when we do this paradigm shift from management to engagement. Instead of traditional recruitment, we instead view our work as cultivation and networking. Recruitment is traditionally outwardly facing, and it's measured in numbers. The way we recruit is essentially, no matter what technologies we use, but essentially recruitment traditionally is asking some community, some individuals, can you do this? Or can you do this? Can you fill this position or that position? Are you a round peg that's going to fit into one of our round holes? And if you're a square peg, then sorry, we just don't have an opportunity for you. Cultivation, on the other hand, is a term that is intentionally borrowed from fundraising, fund development, because fundraisers have long known that you don't just recruit a donor and then, clap your hands and say, great, they're there, and now we're done. You cultivate donors and nurture that relationship ongoingly. So when we cultivate volunteers, instead of saying, are you a round peg that's going to fit into these round holes, we instead are asking, what are the skills and talents that you could share with our organization if we could make it possible for you to do so? And then if it fits one of your available round holes, great. And if not, but it's a skill that could help you achieve one of your strategic priorities, you might be willing to negotiate and create a role for that individual to share those skills. Similarly, we move from placement to instead negotiating opportunities, not necessarily with hundreds and hundreds of volunteers, but for high impact volunteers, we're willing to go beyond placing square pegs into square holes and round pegs into round holes and instead negotiate and make some agreements around the work. Instead of supervising volunteers, we view ourselves as supporters of volunteers in achieving the goals that we've all agreed upon. Doesn't mean we give up our chance to hold volunteers accountable, but it shifts us more into partnership with volunteers. And yet there are still ways to do that and hold volunteers accountable. Continuing on, we shift from reviewing volunteers to instead measuring the impact of their work. I started my career working for probably 15 years or more in different museums, a couple different museums around the country. And so I spent, and this was, I'll give away my age, this was in the 90s, early 90s, and I spent a lot of time reviewing docents. And I got to tell you, I was a very approachable professional, but the tour guides were not always eager to have me follow their tour, observe them, and fill out a review, a performance review form. Because most people aren't eager to have that done. But today, when I work with museums, we talk about a different way to ensure accountability and success from our tour guides in museums. We talk about measuring the success of the tour and ensuring that volunteers have the skills to achieve those goals. Are the students learning? Have you delivered the material that we agreed is non-negotiable? And what additional things have you added to the tour? There, instead of reviewing performance, we're actually measuring the results of the work. And that type of approach speaks to today's volunteers much more closely and much more personally than and you're going to get an annual performance review. In terms of another paradigm shift, we shift from recognition, which is honoring volunteers traditionally for their years of service, their number of hours, to instead a more broad approach. It could include honoring their dedication and commitment through hours and through some of these traditional methods, which in our firm we call the 3 Ps, pins, plaques, and parties, and add in addition to those, acknowledgement of the work that they've done, the impact that they've had. So not just how many hours have you spent in a community-wide Parks and Rec day to shovel mulch in the parks, but, and this is probably more of a Colorado example where we have a water shortage than a New England example, but instead we share how many tons of mulch the families that came out on this day of service day at the parks shoveled, and more importantly, how much water that's going to save the city over the subsequent months, because that mulch helps the plants to retain, and gardens retain their moisture during our drought-ridden summers here in Colorado. So what is the impact that we can acknowledge volunteers are having with their organization? And finally, instead of retaining volunteers in the same position for X number of years, how can we instead sustain a relationship with them so that if they leave because they need to take summers off or they're going back to school, how can we sustain a relationship with them so that they may not be actively volunteering, but instead they're an advocate for us, they're a donor for us, they're an ambassador for us, or they're passing the baton to other volunteers who are going to pick it up and sustain the work with our organization. That's what it looks like when we begin to make the shift, the paradigm shift from management to engagement. And in that way, volunteers are not just one square under our programs box or one part of our governance box. Volunteers are capacity builders holding up, buoying up every operations part of our organization, from our programs, management, our administrative resources, helping us expand our financial resources, and yes, governing the organization as well. When we view volunteers in this way, we open up the opportunity for volunteers to take on significantly different types of roles. Volunteers can be a coach for staff members. They can mentor other volunteers. They may serve as a pro bono consultant, a trainer of staff or other volunteers, and leaders of initiatives or of volunteers. I'll share an example from when we did this Hive project in New Hampshire a couple years back, from one of your actually from two different peer organizations, and then we'll pause and see if there are any questions. So thinking differently about roles that volunteers can take on is an exciting and yet big challenge. And that's one of the things that Canterbury Shaker Village tried to do in their Hive pilot project back in 2013. Canterbury Shaker Village, as many of you may know, is a living history museum with buildings and exhibits that span many, many acres. And they have an annual artisan fair that is not only a big opportunity to engage the community, it also raises funds, raises their image in the community, and certainly helps them achieve their mission of bringing to life the history of the region. The challenge is that it is a very staff-intensive project. It's essentially a one-day event, but it takes an enormous, or at the time took an enormous amount of staff time. So they really wanted to look at, and not just on the day of, but in the months leading up to the Artisan Fair. So by going through some needs assessments, what are some of the needs that we have, and understanding what volunteers at the time were seeking, they created two new volunteer roles. One was a role that helped them prepare for this artisan fair. They called that role the Talent Scout. The Talent Scout was a volunteer. It actually turned out to be a mother of a couple of young kids who were still in school, so she couldn't volunteer regularly every week. But she definitely wanted to use her skills, get deeper in the community, but needed a lot of flexibility. So as a talent scout, she was able to take over the responsibilities that had previously been held by a staff member to go and identify artists and musicians who could be part of the Artisan Fair. In the end, she worked over a couple-month period, and they tracked how much staff time her work saved professionals at Canterbury Shaker Village, and it turned out to exceed more than 40 hours of staff time she was able to free up by doing this work. And she was not able to have committed to a regular weekly shift, especially during the summer when her kids weren't in school, and yet was able to meet on her own schedule at agreeable times with the staff member regularly to be accountable, to check in and be part of the work, but could otherwise make her own schedule in booking artists and musicians for this fair. The second role, I loved the name, they called it the detail wrangler. They engaged a couple detail wranglers who were event support on the day of the fair, and they helped ensure that all the artists had what they needed, the supplies, etc. And again, that freed up staff, and it involved the staff being willing to let go of having it done exactly the way they might have done it, but it enabled them to be much more present and be part of the fair, working with donors and with the community more directly, and giving that logistical responsibility to their detail wranglers. Another example, which is more of a behind-the-scenes example of a new role for volunteers, came from the River Center. The River Center, as you may know, is an organization that works in New Hampshire in their own community to provide family support in a number of different ways to help vulnerable families, whether it's providing emergency wood through their wood program for winter heating or tax preparation assistance. They help families in a lot of different ways. They also had a couple programs at the time that we worked together that were all volunteer run. So they already were looking at high impact and relying on high impact volunteers. One of those ways was that they had a volunteer grant writer, but they knew that they could really build the capacity of their organization if they had additional grant writers. So in thinking about how to recruit additional grant writers, they engaged their current grant writer at the time, who was a volunteer, in thinking it through with them and truly being a partner in the work. And instead of thinking about going to a local university for graduate students who might be studying nonprofit administration, or going to some fundraising associations, or looking to find some experienced writers, they really thought beyond their own organization and some of those predictable, yet sometimes reliable ways to recruit volunteers, and instead pursued the idea that their grant writer came up with, which was, let's really tap into people who want to gain skills, and let's offer a 4-part course in grant writing. Let's offer it for free, except instead of charging a financial fee, we're going to require that each participant research and write 1 grant for the River Center. And when I asked what happens if they don't stay and they take their new grant writing skills and go somewhere else in the community, their executive director said, you know what, that's fine. At the River Center, we're all about lifting up our whole community. So if we train people with new grant writing skills and they take those skills to help another nonprofit in our community, then we have fulfilled our mission as well. They really embodied this idea of getting beyond, these are my volunteers and these are your volunteers. And instead they said, let's open this up to the whole community. And in the end, they've run these courses at least twice. I talked with them about a year ago and got the update. And out of it, they've secured 1 ongoing grant writing professional who or volunteer who has actually moved away from the state but still writes grants for them, and at least 1 board member, and have helped other organizations in the community as well. So when we think beyond some of our traditional roles, we may not only help our own organization, but as in the case of the River Center, we've helped others in the community as well. So I just want to pause before I go on to our next poll and a few other case studies and some tools that you can use to see if there are any questions at all that have popped up. And I might ask Stephen if you can just check and make sure that I'm not missing anything, because I'm having some difficulty seeing the question boxes versus the chat box. So it doesn't look to me like there are any new questions, but I will rely on you all, Stephen and Deborah, if I've missed some. to let me know. Okay, perfect. So feel free to pose some additional questions if they pop up. And in the meantime, we'll keep plowing forward so we can then share some more stories and tools and ultimately the ways that you can engage in this initiative with us through the Center for Nonprofits. So the next thing I want to talk about, since we've talked a little bit about how volunteer roles can evolve to really embrace a shift towards volunteer engagement, wherever you are on the spectrum, you can move further down that path towards skilled volunteer engagement. And I'd like to know which of the following best describes the relationship between your current staff and volunteers at your organization. So open up the poll tab, and a second poll should pop up. There it is. And pick, if you can, make a decision between the best answer that describes your staff. A, most staff consider volunteers as partners in getting the work done. B, most staff direct what volunteers do and how they do it. C, many staff frequently create work to keep volunteers busy. D, most staff don't work directly with volunteers. Or E, yeah, I don't really know, or none of the above. Okay. It's looking like more than half of you characterize the relationship as partners in getting the work done, which is great. For you, 53% of the participants on this call, you're in a great position to build capacity and engage even more skilled volunteers or high-impact volunteers. For the quarter of you who direct what volunteers, or whose staff direct what volunteers do and how they do it, 29% of you, that's not uncommon, and that could be because that's the way your staff has always done it, or it could be because staff are challenged to let go of directing exactly how the work gets done. In which case, you have an opportunity as a leader of volunteers, whether that's in your title or you're an executive director, whatever your title is, you have a responsibility and an opportunity to be a change agent and support other staff members in learning how to let go, but not let go of your intended results, let go of the details. And how can we negotiate with volunteers and agree on the results that we're working towards achieving? Reaching more students through this outreach, recruiting more volunteers for the organization, having a successful fundraiser. What are the different ways that we can do that? So thank you. Thank you for participating in the poll. And let's talk a little bit about this staff role. So if volunteer roles are changing, then staff roles also need to change and evolve. Staff in a world of volunteer engagement shift from being recruiters to cultivators, from being directors of work to instead facilitating the work, from being placement directors to instead negotiating, and being willing to perhaps rewrite or adapt a position description. When I was executive director of an otherwise volunteer-led education organization, I had someone come to me and say, I would really like to help you with next year's conference. I'm a professional project manager. I would love to help you set a schedule, make sure the teams working on the different parts of the conference all know have the resources they need to get their work done, and communicate with each other, and that the conference gets implemented on time and on budget. And I did a silent cheer and said, great, it sounds like you want to be the conference co-chair. And he said, no, I don't want to be the conference co-chair. I just want to make sure that everyone has the resources that they need, that all the teams know what the other teams are doing, and that the conference gets implemented on time and on budget. And I thought, that's the job description for the conference co-chair. And we finally sat down and negotiated, and I realized the piece he didn't want to do was the public speaking. So we created co-chair positions, one with a focus on the public side and another on the behind-the-scenes side, and found a complementary co-chair to his skill set, and that's how we negotiated the job descriptions. We didn't negotiate whether or not the conference got done on time and on budget. We negotiated how the work was going to get done. So how can we as staff members shift our expectations and our practices and be willing to let go of some of those details? Another one of your peer organizations, actually two of them, WISE and Response, both of whom help victims of sexual assault and domestic abuse. One of their challenges when we worked with them back in 2013 and 2014 was that the state, of course, regulates the requirements around training for volunteers to work with victims of sexual assault and domestic abuse, especially in the courts. And so that required 40 hours of training was a barrier for many people, especially in the rural areas, to actually engage as volunteers, because getting to 40 hours of training was a burden. So they wanted to make training more accessible. They ended up engaging teams of volunteers to research the technology needed to look at providing some of this training online. They also engaged some volunteers who understand curriculum development as well as this particular field to make recommendations around which modules of the curriculum could be delivered online versus in person. In the end, this ended up being addressed by more than just these two organizations. There was a coalition that kind of took it on, but the pre-work that the volunteers did that led up to that work was very, very valuable in piloting the changes that I believe ultimately were put in place. But that meant staff were willing to let go of doing all of the curriculum adjustments themselves. Staff need to articulate results, define the time and the authority level of their volunteers, train and source resources, establish checkpoints with volunteers, evaluate the results, and set new goals. And when we as staff members or leaders of volunteers are willing to do that and create and support new volunteer roles that are truly high impact roles, then staff can accomplish more with volunteers than they can do on their own. They are freed up to use their unique talents to do the work that is unique to staff and be able to share because they're sharing their load with skilled volunteers. When we do this, we also see momentum building. More people choose your organization as the place to volunteer. You're able to expand your reach more clients, share your message more widely, raise more funds because volunteers are twice as likely to donate as non-volunteers, and in high net worth donors, they're 70% of high net worth donors who volunteer give to the places where they volunteer. And ultimately, there's increased community awareness and support for your organization. So those are some of the reasons to begin to experiment with new ways to engage skilled volunteers, high impact volunteers at your organization. And so in this last 25 minutes, I'd love to share with you how you can do this through the accountability and support of the High Impact Volunteer Engagement Initiative, the HIVE initiative, that is being presented in New Hampshire through the New Hampshire Center for Nonprofits and Volunteer New Hampshire through generous funding from the Volunteer Generation Fund, a federal grant. Whether or not you choose to apply for this program, and it is an application program, I'd encourage you to certainly stay on and listen, because the way this whole initiative is based on a theory of change that we've seen proven in organizations all across not just New Hampshire, but the United States and Canada. And that is the way to make major transformation in your organization from volunteer management to volunteer engagement to gain all the benefits of strategic volunteer engagement at your organization. You can do it from the top down and overhaul your whole infrastructure, and there are programs that do that, and sometimes they work, or you can start in the way that I like to call it guerrilla warfare. You can start by identifying one strategic way that you can pilot a high-impact volunteer role, demonstrate the power and potential of skilled volunteering, and inspire others at your organization to get on board. It's a low-risk but high-benefit approach to change. So in these next few minutes, I'm going to share some details about this particular initiative. And if you choose to apply for it, we'd love to see your application. And if you don't, you will still gain through these next few slides some ideas and tools and ways that you could, when the time is right, begin to pilot some change and some new ways of engaging volunteers at your organization. So let's jump in, and don't forget to post any questions, although in another 15 minutes or so, we'll also open it up for conversation and unmute you. So this initiative, as I said, is based on a philosophy that one of the best ways to create change that sticks is to innovate with one strategic, discrete pilot project. And when we innovate, innovation really is the key to this type of organizational change. It's the fuel that helps organizations be nimble and flexible no matter what environmental changes they're going to be facing, whether it's economic changes or demographic changes or programmatic challenges. It helps you be responsive to your community's needs because you have more skills and resources to draw upon through skilled volunteers. Organizations are always evolving, and so why are we not evolving our volunteer engagement models to match that and keep up with that and in fact fuel the ways that our organizations are evolving? And finally, innovation helps our organizations be generationally attractive and relevant. As I mentioned, Gen Xers are the most entrepreneurial generation of any existing right now. Millennials are interested in being on the cutting edge of change. And so how can we tap into those generations by innovating at our organization as well? The key is to innovate not just for the sake of innovation, not because it's, the color of the month, but instead in really strategic ways that measurably build our capacity to achieve our mission, that increase our impact and outcome, that help us reach more people and communities with our messages, with our resources as community-serving organizations. And it frees our employees up to steward critical initiatives and do different work, which means it also helps us address staff fatigue and keep our employees engaged in meaningful ways. Ultimately, it also helps us, through these innovations, we can access the abundant resources that we have in our communities as a whole. It really comes from this profound belief that we have that you already have everything you'll ever need at your organization to achieve your dreams. It's in the form of the skills and networks and talents of your volunteers and those who are not yet your volunteers, but we need to be strategic about tapping into them. We'll never, ever have enough money or enough time, but if we tap into volunteers in innovative ways, we can overcome those challenges because volunteer talent is an abundant resource. So we achieve this through pilot projects. And this helps us move from these concepts and all that lovely jargon that I just shared on the previous slide to actionable steps with measurable outcomes. When we pilot an initiative, many people, those who get excited about change, are inspired by the chance to experiment. They approach this with a little more tolerance for risk. When we talk about something as a pilot, then it evokes the idea that it's not yet fully baked. It's an idea that's in progress, which means we give it permission to change. We manage these things in increments. It's less threatening because we create opportunities for feedback. We can improve it, quality improve it along the way, and ultimately it builds momentum for change. The best thing about pilots is that the staff members and volunteers for whom the system currently works can still keep doing what they're doing. This is a way to tap into those who really, really believe in your organization's ability to improve and get better and want to help be part of that. It starts by looking at strategic opportunities to pilot volunteer roles. It starts by looking at what are the demographics and interests of today's volunteers, which we gave you a taste of today, and in the initiative we'll go into in a lot more depth. And then stepping away from that outward look and looking internally and saying, what are our organization's needs and priorities? So even if you don't apply for this initiative, after today, think about what are the most pressing needs at your organization? What do you need more of? What departments are underutilized or overworked? Where could you use some extra talent to help you address these needs? And where there's overlap between those needs and what you've learned about or what you already know about the demographics and interests of today's volunteers, that sweet spot is the prime opportunity to develop a pilot project. So maybe your organization needs to reach more audiences. You don't have enough staff to bring your outreach programs. Then that might be a great opportunity to develop a new role that is flexible and impactful because it also overlaps with the interests of today's volunteers. If, however, what you need is a 40-hour-a-week receptionist, the same person, you may be challenged to find a way to make that fit in this sweet spot overlap. Not every need can be addressed through strategic engagement, but many of them can be restructured to do so. So how do we do that with this particular initiative? This initiative is designed to help 15 organizations throughout the state of New Hampshire develop some innovation. It could be leadership development. It could be focused at diversifying your volunteer workshop. Maybe it's targeted at one particular demographic like millennials or working parents. Depends. It could be about doing deeper cultivation of your existing volunteers. It could be creating more flexible and meaningful opportunities for volunteers. These innovations will be designed to help you experiment with one or more, with one new volunteer role or more to help you build capacity. And how do we do that? Well, we start by exploring the latest trends and best practices. Then I and the New Hampshire Center for Nonprofits will be supporting you to pilot this one strategic innovation. We do that through a webinar, a full-day training, about 6 or 7 months of coaching, and then reconvening through a reunion where we share the results that we've been measuring along the way. The goals of the initiative are these here on the screen: to leverage the energy and skills of motivated leaders. You'll be receiving training and coaching and evaluation. And ultimately, the goal is to grow a cadre of internal volunteer engagement champions, both staff and volunteers. Ultimately, this one initiative will be designed so that you can then learn from it, replicate it, and build your skilled volunteer engagement beyond this one initiative. Who is eligible? Any New Hampshire nonprofit organization is eligible. The one thing we ask or require is that there already be at least a minimum level of current volunteer engagement. This is not Volunteer Management 101. This is not, we're going to help you build a volunteer program. You must have some volunteers already engaging with you, and if you're ready to then enhance that effort, then you are eligible. The commitment that we ask from each organization is that in addition to the application, which I'll be sharing in a moment, you will be identifying a team of at least 4 people, and at least one of them needs to be a volunteer. So this is a staff and volunteer team. We want you to participate in the trainings and the coaching calls, and we require demonstrated leadership support through this effort. So how does it work? It starts with an application, and we'll share the dates for that in just a moment. And then following the application, those who are selected, the 15 organizations, will be required to participate in one webinar, which is our launch webinar, which will be happening very shortly after acceptance letters are sent out in December. And again, I'll have the dates on the screen in just a moment. So we ask that the whole team participate in that webinar. And then in January, we'll also have a launch summit where we will spend a full day in training. This is a picture from our summit a couple years back. And through that training, by the end of that training, every team will have the beginning of a design of their pilot project. Following that training, we then have teleconference coaching calls where you will be using tools that I'll be sharing with you, needs assessments, work plans. I'll share any other templates that you need, like position description templates, information on how to message and interview potential volunteers, progress reports. All of these tools we provide, and over the subsequent months, we'll be meeting 4 times virtually with coaching calls, individual ones, and as an entire cohort with all 15 organizations while you implement that pilot project. And we are here to provide accountability and support for you to do that. Then in October of next year, we will reconvene after you complete a post-project assessment and have a reunion where we will be evaluating or you'll be sharing the success, and we'll be celebrating as well as looking ahead to how we can sustain this project moving forward. So again, the commitment, well, we'll have a slide with all that, but it's one webinar, it's a day of training, a series of coaching calls, and a reunion. Those are the basic requirements, but that doesn't include the actual work of implementing the project, which of course is where the real work happens. Those are the touch points for accountability and support, and the rest is work that you'll be doing as a team and with others in your organization. Picking the right project is, for many, the most challenging part. So I'm going to take just a moment and share a couple examples of projects that this cohort back in 2014 had just finished implementing when we did this Hive initiative back in 2013 and 14. And know that for me, the most fun part and the most exciting, and yes, to some extent for you, the most challenging part is picking the right project, but we're here to help you with that. So here's a smattering of examples of pilot projects that your colleagues implemented in the Hive project a few years back. The Bhutanese community of New Hampshire improved the communication and visibility of their organization by engaging a skilled volunteer who was able to develop, write, design, and edit a newsletter in their native language to their community members. And that eventually morphed into a TV show on community access television. Home Health and Hospice Care built the capacity of their Vigil volunteer program to serve more families in need by engaging and training a team of Vigil team leaders to help coordinate, schedule, and support Vigil volunteers, who are those who provide a presence when an individual is actively dying. By engaging volunteers to help them with technology to allow volunteers to self-schedule, and engaging a team of Vigil team leaders to support teams on a weekly basis. They were able to take an enormous load off of their volunteer coordinator's shoulders. She was doing it all herself and doing it all by telephone, and instead were able to really expand the program to meet the growing needs. Symphony New Hampshire built the Symphony's financial stability by developing and implementing a new fundraising event through the first ever collaborative effort across the Symphony's 3, at the time, otherwise disparate volunteer organizations, the board, the chorus, and the Friends of the Symphony. And they raised $6,000 as a result. So there are many other examples, but hopefully that gives you just a smattering of the potential, and I have examples from other states and from Canada as well that we can share in the trainings. As I mentioned, we provide tools so that you are accountable through work plans and progress reports in order to ensure that you have measurable results. And you'd be amazed, even I was amazed, how many people rated the work plan and the progress reports as among the most valuable part of the process. Which is pretty remarkable. Here I thought my trainings were so scintillating, and what people really loved were work plans and progress reports, which is great. It was actually news that filled my heart. Ultimately, we really wanted to see and saw measurable impacts. As I mentioned, Symphony New Hampshire, they raised $4,000 in their first one, and I already shared the River Center was able to train 6 individuals in grant writing and build from there. We also see results like these. The blue bars represent the pre-test before implementing their pilot projects. These teams rated their practices and volunteer engagement at that level, and afterwards they were able, as a cohort, to raise every area of practice and how effective, rate their performance in every area of accepted volunteer engagement best practices. And you can see that across the board in this chart. So we really invite you to participate, and let me share some of I thought I might have time for one more case study, but I'm going to fly through this to give you the details of the deadlines so that we can make sure we still have 5 minutes or more if you need it for questions. Applications are due November 30th. That's pretty soon, I recognize that, but we are really eager to launch this initiative, and so I believe that the application, which is pretty straightforward and shouldn't take too long to complete, is available on the New Hampshire Center for Nonprofits website, and I suspect Deborah will be able to send out that link to everyone who participated. We then are going to make decisions on selection of the 15 participants within a week. By December 8th, and I say we have some volunteers helping us in being a review team to look at the applications. It's not just the center and me. We have representatives from all 3 organizations, Volunteer New Hampshire, us, and VQ, and New Hampshire Center for Nonprofits, and some volunteers from the community as well, and I believe a representative from the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation. Will all be looking at those applications. We will then inform selected groups by December 8th, and then by the 13th of December, you'll basically will be implementing the initiative for the subsequent 11 months through to October of 2018. Here's what your team will get. You will learn new skills. You will get support in piloting new ways of engaging volunteers. Your organization will be viewed as a leader of engagement, and most importantly, you will be able to build your capacity to fulfill your mission. So here are the specific dates, and I'm going to leave these up on the screen while we open it up for questions about the initiative, about the process, and I'm going to leave it, let's see. If you could use the raise your hand function on your dashboard, then I will unmute you. That'll save us time in typing. So feel free to raise your hand if you have a question about the initiative or the process for application, and we'll be sure to call on you. We don't see any yet. So in the meantime, I'll keep my eye out for that, but I'll also encourage you not only to apply, but to think about whether or not you apply based on the things we talked about today. What is one thing you could do differently to fulfill your mission, to achieve your work, to steward initiatives at your organization by engaging a volunteer to help you to do it? What is maybe one new role? What is a conversation that you could have with your staff member, your colleagues, to help them begin to make the shift from volunteer management to volunteer engagement? And what's in it for you to do so? So I'd love to leave you with that question. And in the meantime, I'll one more time check and see if there are any other questions. I don't see any, but I will promise to stay on the line for another couple minutes. But for those who need to go, I want to honor the 90-minute timeline here and at least wrap up and thank you all very much for participating. And I certainly hope we've inspired you to consider applying for this initiative. I suspect, though I haven't checked with Deborah and Lorette at the New Hampshire Center for Nonprofits, but I suspect that if any of you wanted to speak with any of the 10 organizations that participated a few years ago, that we would be able to make an introduction so you could get an insider view on how that initiative worked for them. And we certainly hope to see your applications coming through by November 30th. They will be available through the New Hampshire Center for Nonprofits website and likely, I'm hoping, through a follow-up email. And with that, I'll just pause for any lingering questions. Deborah, is there anything else you want to add to this before we wrap up and at least stop the recording? Deborah?
I don't have anything to add. I will confirm that we will be sending out an email to everybody who registered for the webinar that will include the link to the application page and the recording. Stephen's helping me here.
Great. And on the application link are all of the deadlines that were listed in the slide deck already, so you don't have to listen to the whole recording again just to find those. And I'm sure that if you have additional questions, you can email the center. And again, we really look forward to seeing your applications, and thank you so much for being part of this webinar. In the meantime, I wish you all great success in your engagement efforts, and look forward to hopefully crossing paths with you in New Hampshire in a couple months. Thanks, everyone. Have a great afternoon.